Good morning. Today is Thursday, February 29th. Happy Leap Day, everyone. Doesn't happen very often, and certainly my first committee meeting on Leap Day. This is the Education and Culture Committee. I'm the chair, Will Jwando. I'm joined by my colleague, Councilmember Albornoz. Councilmember Mink is on her way and will be here shortly. Today we have three items. First, we have a review of the non-recommended reductions for the FY25 to 30 CIP from Montgomery County Public Schools. Then we have an action on a supplemental appropriation 2452 for Northwood High School. And then finally, our third item, an update on the school's system's financial report and the Employee Benefit Fund, which we do very frequently here. So we're going to get started and go through those various programs. I want to thank MCPS for being here, but also for the thoughtful, if not painful, options presented in the CIP, non-recommended reductions. We obviously have a lot to consider here. We're not going to make any decisions today, but we're going to go over the kind of options that were presented, and staff will walk us through what was a great packet. So I want to thank Ms. McGuire and Mr. Levchenko for that. We understand that this is an important discussion, and there are real life implications to this, of like when things are built and when people get delivery of buildings and services, and that has an impact on our school system and our community. And so really just want to underscore and appreciate that. I see we're joined here by Brian Hull and Seth Adams, as well as from O&B here. Good to see you. Is it Jawa? Hawa. Thank you. Yes, we don't pronounce the J's. There you go. Hawa. Ms. Hawa, and so thank you for being here. With that, I'll turn it over to staff. Is it you, Mr. Levchenko, is going to start?
Yeah, Ms. McGuire and I were going to tag team on this first item. I was going to walk us through the non-recommended reductions, and then we also have a discussion, a related discussion of the systemic projects in here as well that Ms. McGuire will handle. Before we get into that, though, I did want to see if MCPS had any opening remarks they wanted to start with and introduce the item before we get into the weeds.
Mr. Hull, anything you want to start with?
Yeah, I just appreciate the opportunity to be here today and share this. Obviously, it is a difficult financial year, as we all know. We have taken the direction of the committee and come back with two scenarios for non-recommended reductions that we look forward to discussing today. And obviously, the board is still interested in preserving the original request they put forward, but understanding the financial limitations. That's what we're here to discuss today. So thank you for the opportunity.
Awesome. And speaking of the board, thank you to Board Member Harris, Lynn Harris, who's here, and a frequent contributor and attendee of our E&C committee hearings, which we appreciate. All right, so Mr. Levchenko, back to you.
All right, so as the committee well knows, they had requested these non-recommended reductions as a result of its first meeting in January, and sent a letter to MCPS requesting this package, and we did get it back on February 13th with, as was just mentioned, two scenarios that we can go through today. But first, I did want to reiterate the challenge that we were facing. On page 2 of the packet, we have a chart that shows the MCPS Affordability Reconciliation Project that was included in the executive's recommended CIP. And that is basically a set of non-recommended reductions that became essentially the target for this package that we asked MCPS. We asked them if they could bring us a scenario or multiple scenarios that would get them closer to the expenditure totals in the executive CIP. Not that we're assuming to go with everything in the executive CIP lock, stock, and barrel, but the fact that the executive CIP does balance based on the latest macro fiscal assumptions. So it is a helpful starting point. But of course, as we go through the CIP process, the intent is for the council to then decide its priorities and work within that affordability to come up with its preferred CIP by the end of this process. But part of that expectation is that we are likely to need to reconsider expenditures in the MCPS CIP, in transportation and elsewhere to make the numbers work. So as a starting point, we asked them to come up with reductions that were about, in the 6-year period, about $92 million. Although more substantially, these reductions were very significant in the first 4 years of the CIP. I've noted in the packet about $346 million. So what the executive did take some money out. The $91 million came out of the 6 years, but also moved a lot of money to later in the CIP. So you actually have positive numbers, or a very low number you've got positive numbers in 29 and a very high number in 30 of increased expenditures, which are basically deferred dollars from the early years. So we have a significant early year problem we're trying to deal with. Now, in terms of what MCPS provided to us, in the big picture numbers on page 3 of the packet, we have a chart that shows both of the scenarios. In the letter from MCPS, they have what they call List A reductions and List B reductions. We call those sort of Scenario A, Scenario B. Both of them came pretty close to meeting the executive's numbers. They did it in different ways, which we'll get into. And I also do want to emphasize these are total expenditures. We still have to go through the CIP and reconcile the impacts on state aid and where that would hit, and also current revenue as well. But the biggest issue was trying to get those expenditures in line, and then we're going to work out the other numbers later. So this was the biggest lift to start with. And both of them came in about the $1.9 billion level, which is almost exactly where the executive is in his recommended CIP. And you can see it doesn't match exactly. We didn't expect it to, but it does get us what the committee had hoped for, which is something close. So both of those scenarios, from a macro standpoint, accomplished what the committee asked. Then we get to a little bit more complicated, what's actually in the scenarios. And page 4 of the packet has a couple of charts that, unfortunately, when they went in the packet, you ended up with a very small font. I apologize for that. But what I tried to do was summarize what each of those scenarios did, and they have some similarities, and then there are some significant differences. First, the similarities of both scenarios A and B. So both scenarios would remove expenditures for the newly proposed Blake High School, Mill Creek Town Elementary School, and Paint Branch High School addition projects. So those are not in the approved CIP right now. They were in the board's proposed CIP that we received back in late November. They would be removed from the CIP, or they would not be put into the council's approved CIP under both of these scenarios. So that's similar to both. Also, there were some technical adjustments made to projects not affecting their schedules. These technical adjustments were made to Crown High School, Northwood High School, and Woodward High School projects. Those are all obviously very large projects, and there is some expenditure flexibility within those. The technical adjustments actually differ within the two scenarios because they were trying to balance the numbers across the years, and because there are other differences in the scenarios, these technical adjustments are a little different as well. But based on whatever the council ultimately does, the technical adjustments in these projects will probably help us balance some of those years out a little bit. So we'll work with MCPS and OMB later on what those technical adjustments ultimately need to be. Both List A and both Scenario A and B also push back construction expenditures a couple of years for the newly requested elementary school major capital projects. These are listed in the charts: Cold Spring Elementary School, Damascus Elementary School, Twin Brook Elementary School, and Whetstone Elementary Schools. So they were requested for the first time this year. They would be happening 2 years later than what the board proposed. In addition to that, MCPS did also increase the assumed placeholder numbers for those schools in the out years. In List A, they added $3 million to each of those. In List B, they added $5 million. And the intent there was, first, they're placeholders to begin with. They're not based on their order of magnitude costs for these schools. Second, they are getting pushed out, so there's certainly a risk that the costs could go up. And third, because they were able to make the numbers work in the 6-year scenarios, they felt it would be a good idea to add some placeholder spending in the out years to help with balancing things as we go forward in the CIP next year and the year after. So it's an interesting idea. I mean, we're not necessarily endorsing it or refuting it at this point, but it's an interesting idea to consider some out-year placeholder costs that are not fully designated yet, not part of our broad set-aside, but part of the school CIP, so we'll be talking more about that. Then you have where these scenarios diverge. With Eastern Middle School, that's a project that has planning money in the approved CIP but does not have construction dollars. Scenario A would push the construction dollars that were newly requested back 3 years. So the board's original proposal had the construction dollars beginning in 28. This would have the construction dollars beginning in 31. Then scenario B with Eastern Middle School has the requested construction dollars pushed back 1 year to August 2029 from the board's request of August 2028. And the reason for that is because of the other major difference in these scenarios. Scenario A identifies 9 countywide systemic projects, and they're listed on page 4 of the packet, and includes some additional out-year funding for those. And this is an issue that we had discussed initially with the GO committee last fall, but then also with the E&C committee in January, that we do have a number of systemic projects that either have very low funding in the out years or in some cases none. And so we're funding the projects appropriately in the first couple years, but then they're not being considered for future funding until those next 2 years come up. And what that does is it does create an immediate gap that we have to deal with. So one of the things that staff has been talking about is whether we should reflect in sort of a truth in budgeting, if these projects really are going to be continuing indefinitely, we should show some reasonable level of funding in the out years. So he had suggested that the schools could consider that, and in fact in scenario A, they did in fact add some significant amount of money in those out years for those systemic projects. Now what that meant was that they didn't have room for some other things like Eastern, and so Eastern got pushed back a little bit further in scenario A than it did in scenario B, because you had a very significant increase in the county-wides. And we'll talk a little bit more about the county-wides in a minute. And then at the secondary level, we had, let's see, I'm just, right. At the secondary level, we had in scenario A, the planning instruction dollars were removed for Magruder and Wooten High School. Although with Wooten High School, the site reconfiguration expenditures, which were part of its major capital project, would be kept on schedule. And we can talk more about the rationale for that. And then the Damascus High School construction dollars were pushed back to begin in FY29, and completion would now be undetermined at this point. And then in List B, similarly, you have Magruder and Wooten pushed back to their construction to 29, so not actually removed, but starting in 29, but they would still have a completion date that would be beyond the completion of the CIP, so they would still be a TBD, but likely earlier than in List A. And then the site reconfiguration expenditures that I mentioned for Wooten would also still be occurring on the schedule that the board had assumed. So those are the rough outlines of the scenarios, and what staff will be doing with that is, as part of that and as part of just a general review of the CIP, we'll be going through the projects and looking at both approved projects and newly proposed projects, and looking at capacity, looking at the key facility indicators for the condition of the schools, looking at the racial equity and social justice implications of these projects. And we'll be presenting that. Our goal is to present that at the next E&C committee meeting on March 14th, and try to get the committee to work through these projects and identify whether these non-recommended reductions, some form of these, list A, list B, or some combination, is what the committee feels is what would need to happen, or if the committee has some alternatives that it would want to substitute in some way here. But in the end, we need to provide some guidance to the council going forward for reconciliation. To the degree we will need to find resources, and we don't know how much that is at this point, then we want to make sure we have the best set of priorities that this committee feels are workable, not recommended per se, but workable going forward. So with that, I'll pause and see if there's any questions or discussion we'd like to have on this.
Thank you, Mr. Levchenko. That's a lot. Obviously, there could be an option C, D, E, and they could combine some of these things. And appreciate you laying out what we're going to do in the future committee meetings. I'd like to see if Mr. Adams or Mr. Hull has any color to add to this about why you made certain decisions. Certainly when we come back next time, as part of our analysis of the racial equity components, why you made decisions, I think we want to hear. I know you all considered those things when you made the suggestions. So let me just start there. I have some specific questions, but do you want to just give any overview of what we got here and why we got it and how you ended up there?
Sure. So thank you for that opportunity. So I think in listening to the description of the two lists, I would probably bring it up a little bit higher level and just explain where we were starting from and ultimately what has translated into these two scenarios. The scenario A is really a focus of our countywide systemics. It's a reflection of the conversations I believe we had both here at C as well as at the GO committees, talking through the idea of a front-loaded CIP versus something that's balanced and spread out. At that time, we talked a little bit about how do you get to that point. It's really focusing on those county-wide programs, HVAC, roofing, having steady revenue or steady budgets across the 6 years, and then ultimately starting to move some of the big projects out. So you start to see that in the scenario A. We have pulled projects out of the CIP, and we've emphasized it's actually $250 million add to put money in the out years for a consistent 6-year expenditure for those countywides. So that's
that was based on what you think is realistic, based on previous history and cost of doing business, and that's where those numbers are not pulled out of the air, right? They're based on what you think it's actually going to cost in those out years.
That's correct, and this is a reflection of our conversations around the infrastructure work, the infrastructure task force, what the backlogs look like in these individual programs. Historically, we actually had a meeting, our board presentation on Tuesday, where we walked through this and spent a lot of time talking about the why. The why of why some of these programs dropped off, why the expenditure value dropped off in years 3, 4, 5, and 6. And the reality has been is those numbers have been impacted through reconciliation over the years. So lowering that to have a more steady CIP, focusing on the first 2 years because that's where your construction projects are. That's been the history of the CIP.
Right.
But as we've transitioned through some of the challenges with the delays, this is an option to focus on the infrastructure, focus on countywide, maintaining our buildings, and then ultimately pulling some projects out and think about reintroducing them at a later date when we think the county revenues are there to support those projects. So I would say scenario A is an idea that's focusing on our infrastructure. It does, again, it removes projects, but I think at this point where we keep seeing delay after delay of some of these projects, it makes sense to just pull them out, have some conversations with communities around when we think they could come back in based on the economic conditions of the county, so that they can come back in and not have delays. So,
right.
So that would be the idea there. The list B is probably more of a consistent approach of what you've seen in the past. Consistent, List B does not remove any projects. It's really trying to move projects around to fit within the county executive's budget. There's obviously delays, there's significant delays in both, but List B does not remove any of the major projects, unlike in List A. So I think the two are really an idea of how do we transition away from what has been called a front-loaded CIP to one that balances the current fiscal climate and trying to maintain projects within the overall CIP. So that's really the background behind the two options and why we felt it was important to present them to you all for discussion purposes.
I appreciate that, and I'm turn to colleagues in a moment. I thank you for doing this. I think it's a good way to start having real conversations about what's possible. Obviously, we're in the situation anytime you decide to do that where there have been promises made to communities for a number of years, and there have been delays. And obviously, it's never too late to start telling the truth. And not that we haven't been telling the truth. There's been good intentionality in wanting to deliver projects, but I do think, particularly what you did in scenario A is a good way to start saying, hey, this is what we have to do. Many of my colleagues have joined me, not just on the committee, but others at schools as we do tours, and we hear this stuff in this countywide systemic. We hear about a lot. HVAC, healthy schools, fire safety, the need to have things upgraded in current buildings, and so that is also a big need in around our 211 schools. So I appreciate that there's a intentional focus here on that. So I guess my one question would be, and then I'll turn to colleagues. While I applaud this move towards this kind of more balanced CIP, how do we manage, or what are your thoughts at this point about managing expectations for some of these huge projects that, again, and some of these are saying either delay. When I look at an Eastern Middle School, which has needed this for a long time, I'm just curious what went into that. And again, we're not making any decisions, but not all of these, as I look at it, seem equal in the analysis of like how great the need is and how long folks have been waiting. So could you talk about that?
Sure, and I would say again the board's request is I believe what makes the most sense for the need. So
course,
this is not something that
it's not what you want to have.
Not what we want to show. But I would say that the challenge with this particular CIP and this particular non-recommended reduction is, as Mr. Litvinenko talked about, the first 4 years of $346 million reduction. That magnitude of a reduction in the first 4 years when you see construction is really difficult to overcome. You can't just move a project 1 year. You can't. If you have a 4-year expenditure, you're talking about moving projects multiple years in order to solve that challenge. So when you do talk about the larger projects, you talk about middle schools, secondary schools, and high schools, their expenditures typically are 4 years, and they have large expenditures in each one of those 4 years. So, the only way to keep a project like Eastern in that scenario is to delay it multiple years within an approach like this. However, I think for us, what's important is that if we are going to start seeing a shift away from some of the larger projects and spending, more time and effort and money into smaller scale systemics, I think there's an opportunity in Eastern to continue the work that we've been doing. We just actually last summer completed a restroom renovation project. We continue to invest in that building on a smaller scale to make sure it meets the expectations of our students and staff, and we would do no different with a scenario where we're delayed. So it's not always great to spend that kind of money into a building that you plan to revisit and do a full renovation, but we are also transitioning our renovation approach. That's why we went to the major capital project. The major capital project is intended to look at buildings very differently than just this assumed, let's come in, tear it down, and rebuild. So if there's an opportunity to take advantage of some of the investments we're making today and translate that into extending the life of the building and also combining with major renovations, we would obviously seek to do that. I'm not saying that's what we're doing at Eastern today, but that's something that we would look at every single project if
Yeah.
it were to be delayed based on this particular CIP process.
And I think that's smart. We need to get to that level of granularity. I mean, there's always been questions about, can we build in a different way when we build something different, and can we be more cost effective? And I know you have strong feelings about what you're already doing. Can we lower the space that we're using, the footprint? But this is another key thing. How do we take a 50-year-old building and have something in between total rebuild and obviously just around the edges, this major renovation? And I think we need to be talking about that pretty openly, about where things fall. And, different schools are in different places based on the amount of money we have. So I do think that's important. Okay, let me turn to colleagues, and then I'll come back if there's not other questions. Do you have anything? Yes. Kristen, you want to start? Councilmember Mink.
Ooh, all right, second. Thank you all for putting this together, and to council staff, this is a really great, helpful packet, much appreciated. Tagging along with what Chair Jawanda said, it would be better to understand the algorithm, and I know that it's not set yet, but the algorithm that you all have been using and would be thinking about using in this scenario of kind of transitioning to a more maintenance forward systemic repairs approach. So, for example, then how do you make a decision about whether it's worth it to be made now, or whether it should wait until there's a bigger project or, a new build or whatever the case may be? Like, how are you weighing those calculations for what different types of projects? I'd be interested in better understanding the algorithm that you're using now, so that we could understand what you would be thinking about under a different approach. Just in general, I agree that I think the philosophy behind scenario A makes a lot of sense. I think it's important to give the public a more clear, accurate understanding of what we're really working with here, so it's not just kind of disappointment after disappointment. And again, understanding that there's no deception or anything that's been here, that this is just kind of a different way of modeling. But I think that it will be helpful for public understanding, even though it's going to come with some, front-loaded disappointments. Hopefully we can then at least bring more clarity about what they can realistically come to depend on in the future. I do look forward to digging into some more of the details here. The details of some of the smaller projects become more important when we're making some of those decisions then, since we are going to be it's going to be clear that some of these bigger projects may have to be delayed. And so, understanding, what exactly falls into some of these systemic projects and why, and whether they're all, how high a priority some of those are compared to some of the other projects. I think getting into the nitty gritty there is going to be important. So I don't know how much we're going to go into some of those today, but I've got some questions that I'll hold on to for them.
Ms. McGuire, I know you wanted to jump in.
So I just want to clarify or add to just a couple of points in terms of, the discussion about what brought us to where we are. As you said, certainly always with good intent, but I think that, this level of, we've sort of are experiencing a collision of factors in the CIP that has been building for a time. One of those factors being that a lot of the projects that we've been, collectively we've been trying to give attention to for the past several cycles are secondary projects. They are by nature large, more expensive, take longer, and take up more both fiscal and time room in the CIP. And as we've experienced the pressures of inflationary costs, there's been a number of pressures then that have resulted in those delays, which have resulted in a stacking of large projects. So it really is sort of a confluence of things coming together, again, through not anyone's bad intentions, but it has left us in a place where, as we're saying, maybe it is time to take a look at how to structure the CIP in a way that can reset what is feasible given our current fiscal approach or fiscal conditions solutions rather, and what approach gets us there. Again, certainly it would be a combination of factors, but I did just want to add that, again, it's been a combination of factors that have brought us to where we are, and it is just sort of what do we want the CIP to look like going forward, and what's the most affordable way to maintain those priorities. In terms of the specifics about the projects, as Mr. Levchenko was saying, what we have in the packet today really focuses on the systemics, and we can go into those. Certainly any questions the committee wants to frame about the individual projects, but when we come back on the 14th, council staff will bring information about the ADA assessment that's been done on each of the schools, as well as the most recent key facility indicator data that has also been done in the schools, and certainly bring back the RESJ data that we had prepared in the first meeting. So that will give some additional lens on the state of each of these buildings, and then hopefully that would help inform some of that granularity. I think today, again, we really wanted to just, these are very different existential approaches to the CIP, and we wanted to frame them as such, and again, have the opportunity for that first conversation. So I would say certainly any questions, but just wanted to flag that we will bring back those more building specific information when we come back next time.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you.
Really appreciate that. Councilmember Albanese.
Thank you. Look forward to digging deeper. I think the headline here is we do have to right size. Sadly, we have to right size the CIP based on all the factors that Ms. McGuire just enumerated, and probably more. And, as we've stated before, this is across all of county government. It's not just impacting MCPS. We're having to make very difficult decisions on library projects, recreation projects, police projects, you name it. And so it's just a tough time. But, we'll get through it as we have before. I think, just speaking for myself, and I've said this before as well, the projects that give me the most pause to delay or hold back on are these systemic projects, because ultimately it could lead to operating expenses. And so if you're not paying for this through the CIP, you're paying for it in another way. And frankly, schools are having to turn on air conditioning earlier than they have, in part because of global warming, which is impacting costs, very significant costs. And so I do think as we dig deeper into this, particularly for these systemic projects, I'd love to just get a sense from you all, if we don't do this, it will, potentially lead to these operating costs. Just to acknowledge that and look at the entire complete picture where possible. And I did have just a couple systemic questions. I've heard from colleagues in DGS that things are starting to level off a bit, and we're getting closer to pre-pandemic levels in terms of construction costs. Are you seeing that as well, or are things still high?
Yeah. So we're not getting back
Not
to
seeing that.
pre-pandemic.
All right.
We are seeing a leveling. I mean, there was every year after year we were seeing significant inflationary costs, square foot cost increases year after year. We are starting to see that level off, and the reason it's starting to level off on the public sector is the private sector is slowing.
Right.
Many projects are paused, interest rate challenges, those sorts of things. So we are starting to see some of the costs level out, so that we do have a bit more of a predictable outlook of around what budgets will look like. But we're not returning to pre-pandemic levels. Those
Yeah.
levels are hundreds of dollars per square foot away from us
Still
where we are
high.
today. Yes.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I guess the other factor we need to look into, particularly as it relates to my district colleagues, is geographic diversity, and being intentional about how we are, we may not be focusing on that, but we often hear from colleagues from certain districts that it feels like their projects are being delayed at a higher rate than maybe other districts. Probably not entirely accurate, but that's a perception that a number of folks have. And so if we can ensure geographic diversity in whatever metric that we use in making these difficult decisions, I think that would be helpful. And then we talked about this extensively at the last session, but the projections of how many students moving forward, it's a moving target, it's tough, and we have to deal with the today while keeping an eye on and trying to think about the tomorrow. But that still continues to give me some pause when you look at the birth rates and the unfortunate travesty of the immigration situation right now at the federal level, I don't think we're going to see as large an infusion of people as maybe we have before. We are in the short term, but probably not in the long term. So it's just a continuing concern of mine, and I know everybody, that we make these massive investments today, and then 10, 15 years from now, we're having to make decisions on the other end and combine schools, which is what we had to do 30 years ago. So I'll be looking at this through that lens as well as we have these conversations. But thank you. I yield back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. And I think as you're hearing, there's a sobering leaning on the E&C committee towards focusing on the systemics and kind of, I don't want to speak, put words in my colleagues' mouths, but I think what I heard is, and I certainly agree with, that that is a good focus for how to, you kind of get to this point where it's unsustainable. We've got all these major big projects, so sometimes it's better to disappoint a whole bunch of people than just, sometimes in some years it's disappointing one or two people or communities. But if we're going to reset, ultimately that will help people have a better confidence in that what we say we're going to do, and I do think that's a good thing. And in addition to making sure we're keeping up the buildings that we have and making those improvements like bathroom restorations and things that are going to have a real impact on the lives of students and staff and faculty. I had one question that I wanted to ask on that just came up, and I know we'll get into this a little more next week, but I want to flag it. We've heard a lot from the Damascus community about the automotive program and the impact that would have. I know Councilmember Lukey has brought it up, and I think I've heard from a lot of people as well. I'm sure my colleagues have. Could you talk about that in the context of this CI? How does that relate to these recommendations?
Yes, that's a good question. And actually, Tuesday we talked quite a bit about Damascus, but we also talked about the Crown and Woodward high schools as well. And I think it's really important to talk about all three at the same time.
Feel free to expand my question.
Where we are, and I'll start with actually Woodward and Crown. Those projects are, the bid numbers have come in higher than where we previously projected them to be. Still less than where we see in neighboring jurisdictions. But what we have proposed to the Board of Education, and we will obviously have some public comments about this, is continuing construction with those facilities without auditoriums, and then come back and build auditoriums at a later date. The reason being is that
at Woodward
and Crown high schools. And the reason being is that if you wait to try to find the money, you're going to delay the start of the projects, and would delay the start of the projects, obviously delay the ending date, which will have a great impact on our boundary study work that we're working through and relieving capacity challenges at adjacent schools. And then you transition up to Damascus again. That's a big project. That's part of our large district boundary work. It is a project that's intended to not only fix the infrastructure challenges at Damascus, but also address the capacity challenges at Clarksburg. What we are proposing is not to rebuild the previous automotive facility as it is. We have not talked about removing the automotive program. It's just we have proposed a different type of facility to support the program. And obviously we have heard quite a bit. Many of our conversations with the community members have been around energy and requests to add that program back as it stands today. And what we presented to the board is that that's certainly a possibility, but it would be an add to the CIP of about $12 million. And so I say this because we are trying to balance all of these projects. We're trying to balance what programs are at individual schools, what programs are at adjacent schools that we may have the opportunity to take advantage of. But the reality is we don't have enough money for all of these schools to do everything that we want, and we are going through some difficult challenges of thinking differently about how we build, the timelines that we build, and so forth. So I would say, yes, we have heard loud and clear the support around Damascus, but unfortunately, as you see, even with these non-recommended reductions, we are at a point where we're making some difficult
Sure.
decisions around how to deliver the best possible program and buildings that we can at all of these schools that impact all of the students.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and thank you for addressing the other two as well. And I think that's the fact that you're considering not using the auditoriums is indicative of kind of where we are. The other good thing about moving in this direction is that people will see, like, hey, look, we have to pay for the community that we want. Like, if you want things in faster and more, and the money has to come from somewhere, and so, or we're going to have to wait longer, and that's okay too, and it's probably somewhere in the middle. But I think it'll also, we need to get away from the kind of like, we're going to give you everything, and the loudest squeaky wheel gets the oil, and no one knows if the date's going to hold. And so I think, again, it's our decision collectively as a community what we want to have and when we want to have it, and I think this will help us soberly look at that and make those determinations. Councilman Mink had a question, I think.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to make a plug for the automotive program also, because I do think that it ties into so many of our other priorities, and I understand you're looking at a lot of very, very difficult decisions, and completely respect that. I think as we weigh a program like that, I mean, it relates to, for example, our difficulty getting kids to come to school. We're looking at severe truancy problems, and we've heard from kids that programs like this keep them coming to school, for example. Now, recognizing that this is a relatively small group of students, but looking at then how to expand something like that, an area where we're seeing success, rather than taking it away, would be of interest. Being able to work with our with career programs, moving kids into career programs and interest areas that are of interest to them, workforce development. There's just so many positive tie-ins with this that I would be interested in looking at how we can expand these rather than taking them away. And when we look at what we've heard from the public, also, I think that that as a priority is reflected there as well. So I have a lot of concerns about moving in that direction, and I understand that you're looking at a different type potentially of the automotive program looking different. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Sure, and we agree wholeheartedly with what you're saying, and so what we presented on Tuesday was this idea that we could create lab type of space that could serve the same purpose, similar purpose. Not necessarily bringing in multiple vehicles at a time with the full lifts in the spaces, the full pant booths in the spaces, without having the need to provide the storage for 40 to 50 vehicles on site to be able to do this. So we're looking at it in terms of a lab space to be able to bring in different components for students in let's say year 1 or year 2 of the program to be able to take advantage of that. And then we also talked about at the board meeting when we opened Seneca Valley, that was decided at that time that would be more of an up-county Edison type of facility. And the reason for that was to bring in the construction trades. We have a full complement of automotive technology equipment at that building. So what we have proposed is that you have the ability to continue the automotive program at Damascus, but for those that are continuing into the certificate program, maybe in years 2 or 3, that they're able to go to the Seneca Valley facility in order to complete that work.
Does Seneca Valley have space for that?
So yes, they have a robust facility. What we're working with the curriculum office is the number of students that can come in at any given time.
Right.
And that's what we've heard is that it's at capacity at Seneca or it's at capacity at Gaithersburg. Right. We do think there's opportunities to add more students and to think a little differently about our approach to these programs. To exactly focus on what you talked about is to bring more kids in and not just have it capped based on how we continually do it. So if we can open up more lab space, to be able to do some of those introductory elements of these programs, that would be a tremendous benefit. And we encourage everyone to look at Seneca Valley. Seneca Valley, the construction trades space is very different than what was built at Edison. The idea around Seneca Valley was to transition away from what we had historically been doing in that trade, which was build large components of residential homes and then go out and build the student-built home. The idea at Seneca Valley is to continue some of that work, but also transition into the commercial arena. We have the ability to do the teaching spaces, then we almost call it like the dirty lab space that's in the middle, to bring students from that teaching space out to the lab space to be able to not only focus on the work that they're doing, let's say if it's electrical or mechanical, but then coordinate with the students that are in the plumbing shop or the masonry shop. So we're thinking very differently about how the spaces are configured and how we're delivering to get more kids involved based on how we configure facilities. So that's the approach that we're taking for the automotive program.
So I understand I sent you off on a bit of a tangent. I appreciate the background and the detail there. This is something that, I think my colleagues are also interested in doing, a joint committee session with the Economic Development Committee to dig into this more. And I appreciate the ideas that you all are bringing to the table. Again, I think that expanding, adding some of these components rather than replacing, thinking about this as a former teacher, and the substitutions that you're talking about here, the kids who are being brought to school, who are being attracted to these programs for Model A, which is hands-on, that's a different group of students who are interested in this other type of work. And so, we want to be reaching all of these students, but it's not, you can't just replace one with the other and think that we're going to be serving in the same way. And understanding also that these programs, a lot of this is volunteer run and volunteer driven. And so, there's a scalability question here that I think there's a bigger question about, we've got great programs that are serving, relatively small groups of kids very, very well from what we're seeing. It would be great to keep those, to find a way to expand them even, which I realize is not what you're talking about doing right now, but I would encourage us to keep having that conversation. And I don't know what that looks like in terms of scalability when so much of it is volunteer driven and is not actually being funded by the county and by MCPS. So I think there's a lot of conversations that we need to have around this. But for now, I just want to express my concerns about diminishing or removing these programs, and about a backup plan being, at a school that's already at capacity where there's a wait list. That just still is not making a ton of sense to me. But I think we're going to come back to some of these conversations. Appreciate the thought you all have put into it. Thanks.
We will. Thank you. And we're dipping into next session, but it's good. It's good to know what we want to talk about. I'm going to turn to Ms. McGuire to go run through the countywide projects. I will mention, just to Councilmember Mink's point, Mr. Adams, Mr. Hall, about the automotive. Damascus and Seneca Valley, it's like 25 minutes in the car. It's an hour bus ride. It's like it's not really close. So as far as the distance, and so just I know you know that, but it's something to think about. And Grace Rivera Oven is online. She's one of the millions watching at home, so I want to thank her. And she's a little sick, but thank you for sending me a note. Ms. McGuire.
Thank you. So the final section of the packet does cover the systemic projects that, of course, we have been talking about. And I will just address them globally, and then if there are any that council members want to dive into, of course we can. So as discussed, the systemic countywide projects are the projects that address a lot of the aging infrastructure components of a building. There's roofs, there's HVAC, there's ADA, fire safety, there's a wide range, and these are what we call umbrella projects, where there's a level of funding in the project as a whole, and then that funding supports multiple projects at schools across the district and across the county. If you look at pages 6 and 7 of your packet, identify the 9 systemic projects that were identified by MCPS in the non-recommended scenario A for additional funding. And so I'm just going to walk briefly through what happened there. Again, the table on page 6, what you see here is that in each of these projects, the first 2 years, FY25 and 26, those are the increased requests that the board put forward for additional funding in those years. In some cases, the funding continues the prior year FY24 expenditures, but in each case, they're higher than had been previously approved in FY25 and 26 specifically. And as you can see, the pattern then falls off significantly, 27 to 30. And of course, this is the conversation that we've been having regarding the out-year funding. What happens at the top of page 7 is that this is a table that then shows the impact of, again, non-recommended scenario A. And as you were pointing out, Mr. Jawanda, the numbers that are put forward by the school system for these projects, in most cases, continue that increased level of funding, that increased level of effort that is being requested in 25 and 26. So that is where that is coming from. It's not just sort of money, but it reflects a level of effort that has been determined to be necessary in each of these cases for the first 2 years, and often that's continuing the level of effort that we have seen in the recent years as well. As committee members may remember, every 4 years we do an infrastructure maintenance task force report, and the GO committee heard this is one of those years. I guess we do the 1 leap years, and this the GO committee received an overview of that report earlier this month in February. Each of the projects in your packet that are covered in that report do indicate the findings, and essentially, no surprise to anyone, the findings of that report are that across all the agencies, in general, our systemic projects and countywide infrastructure projects are underfunded relative to what an annual budget would be that would replace things on an anticipated life cycle. So that is the relative benchmark that report seeks to establish every 4 years. We work with all of the different agency, capital budget, and facility managers to identify what's their total inventory of all of these different system pieces and what is the anticipated lifespan of that. And then if you replace it on a lifespan assumption, what would that dollar amount be? And then we measure the current budget amount against that dollar benchmark. Not with any expectation that we will be able to do that 100%, but it certainly does give us an indication of where we are in that cycle. And so if you take HVAC as sort of a predominant example, and that's outlined on page 9 of your packet. The heating, ventilation, and air conditioning project, this is continually a high priority. It is, as committee members mentioned, an area we hear a lot about. And these are also projects that are getting more and more expensive, partly because of complexity of systems and partly because of the cost pressures we've been talking about. And so this is also an area where the system has been requesting increasing amounts of money each year as well. The FY 25 and 26 amount of $35 million would be approximately 68% of that target budget annual amount that we were just discussing. So that's actually a pretty good measure, and it's fairly high relative to the percent of that target if you look at it compared to other projects that we have across the board. So
Basically a doubling.
Correct.
In those years, yeah.
Correct. And so that would, if we represent, again, under this non-recommended scenario or however we move forward, if we represent that continued level, then we would know that we would be hitting between 65 and 70% of our target replacement amount each year, which just, again, keeps us on track. It's not a one-to-one relationship, but it gives us an overall picture of how those systemic projects are proceeding. So again, just wanted to call that out as one example, and again, I think it highlights the importance that we were talking about of the systemic projects, what we're accomplishing with them, but it also does highlight the funding challenge of bringing all of them up to that level in the CIP.
Thank you. And as you're speaking, you made me think of something I wanted to say. I know we're doing the CIP, but we will eventually get to the operating budget for both of you. And what I would love to talk about, just flag at that time, is the interplay between these systemics and the maintenance staff required and hired to actually implement and, get this stuff done in a timely manner, right? One of the things I've been hearing at schools is that, we have, I don't know what the number is, I won't use it, I'll use X, but X much lower than 10, like numbers of electricians or people who can do things that are beyond the building service worker level type work. And so I would love to just talk about it, at that, you can say something now if you want, but at some point before we finish this budget, the interplay of making sure that how this interplays with, if we put more money into these systems, how that might, either lower the need for those types of positions or increase, just, I want to be thinking about that. Do you understand? Okay. Because that's something that comes up a lot. And it's great to have the new systems or higher maintenance money in there, but we also want to make sure that there's enough on the operating side for people to get stuff done in a timely manner as well. So, and I know you all share that concern. Do colleagues have any, and I'll ask colleagues if they have any other things. The other thing is the safe access to school and the pedestrian stuff. I really think that's important. We made a big push on the council, and as you know, I've been laser focused on safe routes to schools for years, but one of the things we find is that we can identify them, but we never have enough money to make the improvements on both sides of the street, on the MCPS walk sheds and on what DOT is responsible for in the interplay. So I'm really happy to see that money in here. I think it's another way that this type of approach can improve safety and access and life for the folks around the school community. So, colleagues, anything on these projects? Yeah, Councilmember Ray.
Thanks. I had a question about the HVAC program. So even with the increase that we see in scenario A, the $35 million a year is only 68% of the acceptable annual replacement cost. And so I just wanted to understand what the plan is with that, or is that because we tend to make up the rest with grant funding, or are we just underestimating what we know is going to come before us, or what's the deal with that?
So I just would, and before the system may want to speak to this, but I just would say that the annual replacement cost is an estimated target. No project in county government, any agency, is at 100%. I mean, 68% is actually high, which again, I'm not saying that's a good thing, but I just wanted to put it in context that the budgeted level in, again, every case across the board, the infrastructure report does show that we're operating below the arc in every case.
Okay, not great news, but thank you. Helpful. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And one piece to this particular program too is many of our systemics, actually almost all of our systemics, the work occurs over the summer months, and so a bit of the balance here is what is the local contracting community able to accomplish within that 2.5 month window as well. So we found at the current market conditions about that $35 million is sort of pushing it a little bit around what they can do and what they can't. So yes, I think if there was more money, we could do more, and we could really start to make a huge dent in the backlog. But we also have to balance some of the logistics of how this work gets done along the way too. Again, not a perfect answer, but we can't risk not opening a school in September because we weren't able to accomplish what we needed to over the summer through one of these projects.
Absolutely. I mean, I know that we all hear from families about HVAC issues, and so for sure. And then it'll be good once we get to the operating budget, obviously, to talk about the tie-in with the fact that we need people who can be making repairs to that, so that we don't have schools that are sitting there waiting for a week or two while rooms flood or whatever the case may be, that they can actually get those repairs done, and that you all have the staffing that you need to do that. Two others categories that I would like to get more detail on are ADA, which I know we're going to get into more, and just understanding the standalone projects of higher priority that are mentioned there. Like, what does that look like? How does the flow work for those, and how are decisions made around it? And the sustainability initiatives. And there's a couple examples given there: composting, enhancing energy efficiency. But it would be great to get some more detail on those as well. Thanks.
Thank you. And I made the mistake of recognizing one member of the board, not others. I've now received messages from other members of the board who are watching. So to Board Member Wolf and Board Member Evans and all the board members, Sondrowski, and all the board members, hopefully the student board member is in school. But we thank you all for tuning in. Councilmember Albornoz.
Yes, we do. This is unrelated to this specific component, but I meant to make this point at the beginning of this conversation. We should also list the community use of schools and the numbers, the thousands, tens of thousands of county residents who access our school facilities above and beyond our school system. that acknowledging these are assets not just to the districts, the school districts, but the entire community. I think that's important to note. And then second, with regards to the sustainability initiatives, I assume when implemented, those could lead to savings in other ways. And so, conversely, to the point that I made earlier, the opportunity cost is a cost, and so that's something that should be documented somewhere, and I think would be helpful. And then, one of the line items that sticks out that as a parent you would be concerned about is fire safety upgrades. Could you just talk a little bit about that? And, our schools are safe. I want everybody to know that, but just talk a little bit about that specific line item.
Sure. The fire safety upgrades is obviously keeping pace with code modifications. It's really obviously focusing on many of our aging infrastructure. Similar to a roof, if a component related to life safety is getting towards its end of life, we absolutely are going to replace it. It's not something that you stretch out and try to continue the maintenance through it. So it's an important project for everything from PA system replacements, our emergency generator replacements. We have a variety of different fire access to our schools. Those codes have changed over time, so bringing the sites up to current code around how fire trucks access the buildings, where fire hydrants are, those sorts of things. So it is obviously a critical, important project for us. But yes, we're not going through solving violations. That's not what we're doing here. It's just really maintaining what we have and improving what we have along the way.
Thank you. Just want to uplift that. And then finally, again, unrelated to this, and we don't have to get into this right now, but one of the projects among many that have been very successful in terms of public-public partnerships has been the partnership between Parks and MCPS to update the quality of our fields, with Parks taking over responsibility of maintenance because of their experience and expertise, which has really led to improved access and enhanced access sort of across the board. So I'd love to get an update on that, not right now, but as we go through the CIP process, I would assume that line item appears in Parks' budget, but if it appears in MCPS's, then we need to acknowledge that too. But that's just opening up a whole world of possibilities and really improving the quality of life of a lot of our kids in a variety of ways. So wanted to flag that.
Thank you. Councilmember Mink has, I think, one more question. Oh, Ms. McGuire, yes, and then we'll go to Councilmember Mink. Go ahead.
I can do after.
Okay, Councilmember Mink.
Sorry, going back to the school, I could probably wait till our next item also, but I had also wanted to ask Mr. Adams if you could speak to the facilities that'll be available for Northwood students at Woodward in the fall.
Yes, great question. So the Northwood students will transition over to the Woodward facility this summer. The facility, we're going through final cleaning for the most part of the building itself. So when they arrive, they'll have access to full complement of a brand new high school facility, absent athletic fields, outdoor amenities, an auditorium, and an auxiliary gym. Those are all part of the Phase 2 part of Woodward. But we actually did spend quite a bit of time tailoring parts of the building to meet the needs of Northwood for when they arrive. So right now we're just working through a lot of logistics, transportation, access logistics, after hours functions logistics. But we're really excited about students transitioning over so that we can get started with the Northwood project this summer.
Thank you.
All right, Ms. McGuire.
Thank you. I just wanted to point out in quick conclusion that there also are projects in the countywide and systemics that are not identified for this level of continued additional out-year funding. Those are represented on page 10 of your packet. And again, many of these are at a higher level of that their early years and their later years are closer together, but again, just did want to sort of point that out, that the non-recommended scenario we're talking about addresses many but not all of those issues. Also, just wanted to comment, certainly as has been expressed here, there's generally support for these increased levels, and of course all of that will just have to be part of that final decision, both in terms of the MCPS budget, but final reconciliation across the CIP as well.
Yeah. Yes, and I think as the packet notes, staff supports these increases, and I think you're hearing the committee supports these increases in systemics. obviously, everything is always pending affordability and reconciliation, but we like the direction. So we will move on now, I think, to our second item, which is on a supplemental appropriation for Northwood. We just talked about Northwood. Yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Thing. Just add another factor for the non-recommended reductions. We suggest council to look also at state aid when looking at the non-recommended reductions, ensuring that we have enough projects eligible for the state aid, especially the traditional state aid, that we have enough to apply for. Any state aid that we are unable to apply for, that is left on the table, we won't get back. Also, we recommend looking at projects that have duplicative efforts in the county. Montgomery County is planning to create a welcome center for newcomers, and also for projects that have duplicative expenditures. Like we know the Pillar project has expenditures that are eligible under the Healthy Schools Facility Fund program from the IAC.
Appreciate that. And obviously, I've not known Mr. Adams and company to try to leave state aid on the table, but I think that's a good point. We want to maximize that, and I appreciate the comment about efforts overlapping as well. Okay, so let's move to the appropriation for Northwood.
Yeah, our next item is an amendment to the FY 23 through 28 CIP and supplemental appropriation of the 24 budget that the school system had sent over back in December for Northwood High School addition facility upgrade. You've got a cost increase in the project that, as noted in the request, related to some of the issues we've talked about. Supply chain issues, staffing shortages, things like that, leftover issues that have really been sort of trailing us a bit since the pandemic. So we have that issue. And then they also do need an appropriation increase so that they can move forward with the construction contract for this project. Now, I will note in the proposed CIP, because of the delays that were talked about with regard to the construction timeline for Woodward High School and the linkage to Northwood High School's project, both those schools are recommended to have a one-year delay for production reasons, not for fiscal reasons per se. But those are how they're reflected in the board's proposed CIP. But the award for this construction contract is still needed. It's just a longer construction period. So we have that issue in front of us. Now, it was already assumed in the board's request, and this increase is also assumed in the executive's recommended CIP. And we do also have an increase in state aid assumed for this project. It is being bid under prevailing wage, so it goes above the state cap of 25% if you are doing a prevailing wage project. So the state aid has been incorporated into this project as well to reflect that. So staff's recommending approval of this at this time. We can talk more about the specifics of the Northwood project, and we talked some about Woodward already as part of the CIP going forward. But this is needed in order to move forward with the construction contract.
Appreciate it, and thank you for correcting me or adding that there's a CIP amendment change. It's adding a $5 million cost increase, right, to take the project up to $208 million. Just so you know what it costs to doing business for a large high school in Montgomery County, and then also the special appropriation of $9 million and change to execute the contract. Mr. Adams, would you have anything to add on any of this?
No, I would just say, as part of, we did extend the duration of this project, and the reason we extended the duration, obviously, was the challenge of receiving materials, but also it saved upwards of over $10 million by extending the duration of the project. So again, I think another example of how we're looking at a variety of different ways that are still impactful to our families and students, but really trying to continue forward with all these projects within the budget limitations that we have set forth. So I think this is a good example of doing a lot of things to try to bring the project within budget and balancing, the impacts along the way.
One other thing I did want to note, there was a racial equity impact assessment done as it's done for all supplemental appropriation requests. And I think the assessment, obviously, it's looking at the incremental increase, but really what it looks at is the project itself. And it did note, and I'll quote, that the project will advance racial equity and social justice in Montgomery County as it provides resources to address overutilization and increased capacity at Northwood High School and the Down County Consortium, which largely serves students of color. So we talked earlier about the RESJ lens. It gets a little messier when you're talking about supplementals as opposed to looking at priorities when projects are before you as a project moving forward. But just to note that in this case, it does seem to fit within the prior priorities we'd already talked about.
Absolutely, yeah. Northwood High School, I know this is a big need for that community and those students. I think last year I tried to go to a different school. Each year I was at Northwood for the first day of school, and was part of the clap in and and hand high fives. And not every student does it, but a lot did. So yeah, no, I know they'll be very excited about this. So colleagues, any comments? Okay, so without objection, I think we'll approve both the CIP change and the appropriation, send it to full council. Okay, we can move on now, I think, to our third item. Thank you all for joining us. The fiscal update. Thank you, Mr. Adams. Thank you, Mr. Lipchenko. Thank you, Ms. Wara. And Mr. Wire, are you going to lead us through here? Okay, so I'll turn it over to you to frame us up. And thank you.
Thank you. So this discussion is to discuss the current financial report of the Montgomery County Public Schools and its relationship to also the status of the Employee Benefits Fund. So I'm going to just sort of walk through some of the nuts and bolts and the aspects of that, and then certainly we can have fuller discussion, and the school system will want to comment as well, I'm sure. So again, as this committee is very familiar, the school system prepares monthly financial reports and presents those to the Board of Education monthly. We receive those as a transmittal, and certainly the Education Committee discusses them frequently, multiple times a year and as needed. The report that was presented to the Board of Education on February 6th reflects conditions as of the end of December 2023. There's always obviously a little lag time in terms of closing out the books and providing a report. So we're going to talk about the monthly financial report specifics in just a moment, but I want to also flag that certainly this committee is also aware that MCPS has been sharing for quite some time concerns about the status of the Employee Benefit Fund. And the Employee Benefit Plan Fund is the insurance fund that holds the both employer and employee contributions to the healthcare costs and the healthcare plan for the system. Again, those funds operate separately from the general operating budget. Same is true in county government. The budget will contain an amount that is the employer contribution. That contribution goes into the fund. That is the expenditure for that piece of the budget. And then that is a contribution to the fund that, again, is receiving revenues also. So the fund operates with, again, it collects revenues from the county government and from employees and from interest and other things, but then also, again, its expenditures are in response to claims activity and therefore can cross fiscal years as needed. So the Employee Benefit Fund, again, it has been raised that there are concerns about the impact of recent cost expenditures in healthcare claims on the health of the fund, and the system in January began to implement expenditure restrictions in the operating budget in an effort to generate additional savings that then can be used to support the employer contribution for additional dollars to go into the benefit fund. So those expenditure savings in the operating budget then again are to generate additional revenues that the system can allocate towards the fund. Another action that the board took on February 6th was to request a supplemental appropriation of $5 million, again as a contribution of additional funds to the Employee Benefit Fund. The source of funds that was identified for that is unappropriated fund balance. And so certainly that request has been made and transmitted to the council and the executive. It is not technically before the council yet in that we haven't introduced it, but certainly the committee may want to indicate its views on that today, and that could facilitate the process. So working backwards, just to tie these things together for a moment, if you look on, I'm sorry, there's no page numbers, page 2 of your packet, again, the most recent financial report that was presented to the board in February reflects financial conditions as of the end of December. That does not reflect yet the impact of the expenditure restrictions that were put in January. So certainly we may see additional savings generated, and these numbers may be higher in terms of the anticipated surpluses when we receive additional financial reports in the future. At this time, however, the financial report does document that due to previous years' unexpended fund balance, there is currently $8.23 million in available unexpended fund balance to the system. So there's more than enough to cover the $5 million that is being requested, and council staff certainly would recommend support for that appropriation when that comes over. Once funds are appropriated to the school system under state law, they cannot be transferred for any other purpose, but the school system can't access them until the council reappropriates them. So again, this is just a normal practice for these dollars, but certainly the school system has identified a very beneficial need for these dollars, and council staff would support taking that action when it comes to the council officially. Turning now to the Employee Benefit Fund data. Again, council staff did analyze several recent years of trends of expenditures, budget, actuals, and revenues in the fund, and have identified, again, just wanted to look at those trends, look at them in the context of what factors impacted the current state of the fund. And certainly, I think what we see is the budgeted dollars and the budgeted contributions essentially over time being lower than the actuals and the expenditures that were realized. There also had been at one point in time a fund balance going back to FY19 that substantially exceeded the policy level, and the system did take a couple of actions at that time to begin to draw that down. Again, that is also a normal practice. I think one piece that potentially had a larger, more recent impact was the system's decision in FY23 not to allocate $30 million to the fund in FY23. That certainly did create an additional dip in the fund's fund balance that has been difficult to come back from. But again, combined with that is certainly some very bad luck, if you will, in terms of recent claims experience and healthcare experience. We do not have comparable data yet for the other agencies in county government. We will have more of that information as we come into the county government, into the operating budget, and we'll be able to know then sort of more context about these experiences. But again, certainly the actuals do document what the system is reporting. So at any rate, when we look at the FY25 dollars, when we come back in the operating budget, again, certainly we'll look at the amount that the system has recommended in FY25 as the employer contribution. We can discuss this further in that context. The purpose to today was really, again, to review the current state, lay that foundation for the FY25 discussions, and begin to understand the context for the FY24 appropriation that is being requested.
Thank you. A lot to chew on there, so I really appreciate it, and I think that's why it's really important we do these updates. I have a couple of questions related to the healthcare costs, but also just the freeze in general, and it's probably either whoever's most best positioned. My understanding is that the freeze, which has happened in the past, came a lot earlier in the year than traditionally done for as far as the impact on schools, as far as being able to having to spend money. Could you talk about the why of that and what you're looking at for next year, and kind of just where we think we are, and the impact that's having and the feedback you've heard? I don't know if it's Mr. Hall would be best or whoever, however you want to handle it.
Good afternoon. Rob Riley, Associate Superintendent of Finance. So with regard to this freeze, it might seem like it is a little earlier, but if we look at the last freeze, which was FY16, that actually started in July. In FY15, we did a late year freeze, but then we rolled right into a freeze in FY16 in July. So that's kind of the history of the freeze. The reason why it came up here, and I appreciate the packet, it clearly explains kind of what we were up against. That those increased utilization and rates really forced us to do something because, as was mentioned, when we had that high fund balance, we had tools to kind of bring that down. But going the other way, we don't really have the tools. Our only tool is to kind of see where we can have savings during the year by making these cuts. So expenditure restrictions came about in January. What you're looking at now does not include that. In future financial
We'll have
reports,
that.
you'll see that grow. And the intention is to move that into the EVP fund.
Got it. And then obviously use of the $5 million. I mean, I think from my perspective, we'll get it formally from you, but that seems like a perfectly normal and good use of that funds, and I can't imagine colleagues will have any issue with that. But on the topic of the increased healthcare costs, when you were here, you switched from Care First to Cigna, and at that time going from fee for service to the capitation model, which you can explain if you'd like, but you anticipated you'd get some savings. That has not been realized, or where are we on that?
No, I guess unfortunately that has been realized, but not, we've had savings, but if we did not make that move to Cigna, we'd be in the hole by
Even
more than
more.
$10 million more.
Okay, so you did
it's
get the
helped
$10 million
alleviate,
savings.
but it has not put us, in the black because of that.
Right. And the switch of what you said, the decision to put less money in, obviously the timing kind of all came up together. So you realized the savings from the change, but just not enough. Okay. Another thing related to healthcare, the packet notes the increased prescription costs for peptid drugs that are used for diabetes, but also, a lot of folks are using them for weight loss. This is Ozempic and drugs like that obviously require doctor approval, and you have nothing to do with that. But have you are you evaluating, preventative or wellness healthcare services, or, because I don't think this is going away. I think this is going to be a trend, and I'd be interested to see when we get to the operating budget and the comps across county government. I'm assuming we're seeing the same thing. But have you all thought about this, have talked about it, addressed it at all in any way?
Yeah, for this particular item, we have addressed that with, because we have other stakeholders or associations
Sure,
and all too.
yeah.
So this is one aspect of plan management. We really haven't done a deep dive in our plan itself in many years. So, we've done benchmarking, and, we have a very rich plan compared to our other LEAs as well as other governmental entities. So this is one particular instance where there is potential savings of looking into that GLP spend, and we're working on that as well too. We've been meeting constantly with our healthcare consultant as well as Cigna too to look at these issues,
right.
and our associations.
Great. Well, keep us posted on that, obviously. And then the last thing I'll ask for now, and then turn to colleagues. In December, when we spoke, the Category 4, which is the textbooks and instructional materials, I had raised this at that time. It was projected to have a $1 million surplus. It's now looking like it's on track for $2.5 million surplus. Are we overestimating for this category, and or is it lapses in positions? Which I don't imagine in that category. So what is going on there?
Yeah, so Category 4, normally that is an area where, in the past, when we had a $25 million fund balance to balance the next
Keep
year.
coming back to that.
I know, I don't want to talk about that a lot, but that is kind of where where we had some cushion, as well as Category 3. If you notice here, Category 3 is only a $300,000
Right.
above variance, a positive variance. When we look at the numbers now, I think that's actually going lower. And that is kind of where a lot of the other part of that $25 million kind of was budgeted. But also in Category 4, So one of the things you'll see as we go over the next couple of months, that is an area that was subject to our expenditure restriction. So you're actually going to see that variance grow to an extent because schools were
Going up.
the variance is the savings is going to
Saving,
go
yeah,
up.
that's what I mean, yeah, savings
Yeah.
will go up.
In the past, we had savings there from the 25 million also because we closed the books early. We started doing that the last couple of years as a measure, not only to get to that $25 million savings, but also to help close the books early. It makes that process easier. So you're going to see that number expand a little bit. Now, I think we talked last time with that expenditure restriction, we do have exceptions. So we have a committee that looks at exceptions for schools. And schools were not touched with staffing. It was just supplies and materials. But specifically, that is one of the categories that is affected.
Well, one of the things I brought up last time, and I'll bring it up again, was that related to this surplus, which is now grown and what you expect to grow again because of the freeze, is going back to teachers for reimbursements of classroom items. Like something I continually hear when I'm out is that teachers are and I've experienced with my own kids, is that teachers are doing this because they care about their kids. They're going out and purchasing things. They're making sure that they have what they need, either because it's taking too long or they're not. So I just want to, whether it's this fund or something, I want to make sure that, and maybe it's an operating budget discussion, but that if there's money left over in an account for textbooks and instructional supplies, that there's a nexus between what's happening on the ground with teachers using their own money to purchase things, and they should be reimbursed. Those should be, whether it's an exception or there's a process that's set up. So, I would, if you have anything to say on that, but we can come back to it. I just wanted to flag it right now. Any comments on that? Or
I would just say that there is never an expectation that teachers would use their own money to purchase supplies. It certainly does happen, but the process that we have in place is that schools, receive their allotment of funds. Teachers need to, approach their administration when they need something and follow through with that process. And so we would make sure that the funds exist to have the classroom supplies that are necessary. There are obviously times when people go above and beyond for their students because obviously teachers, that's why they're in this profession, is to make sure that they're providing a great experience for the children. But our expectation is that we're providing the funds necessary
that are needed right now.
Even right now.
Okay,
Absolutely.
Well, just something to our board colleagues just to talk about more too. I mean, I just think I know I'm not the only one to hear this. So, okay, thank you. Any comments from colleagues on any of these items? No? Anything you want to add, Mr. Hall?
I would just add, in addition to some of the cost-saving measures and the supplemental appropriation that we have put forward that Ms. McGuire offered up, I just also would add that in the current FY24 budget, which is not captured in the table here, we did budget for almost $30 million for our employee benefits plan. In addition to that, at the end of last year, we were able to scrape together savings in the area of about $14 million that we also were dedicated to the employee benefits plan. So we have been, taking action from both the revenue side and now the expenditure side to try and address this issue.
Appreciate that. So this is our update, so there's no action to take here. I know Councilman Mink has a comment on another topic before we close out.
Thanks very much. This is outside the scope of our agenda today, but I just wanted to flag it because I know we're all hearing from a lot of parents, the Title I issue. And so I just wanted to flag that that's something we'll want to come back to, obviously, during the operating budget conversation. And, maybe in addition to that, want to recognize that schools move in and out of Title I, that is part of the Title I process. But we have some very heavily impacted schools that are seeing that now. We're having, issues with, enrollment and how that's elementary versus second. There's a lot of complicated issues coming into play, and there's not an easy answer here. And there's one thing that I've learned as we've kind of dug into this conversation behind the scenes. There's nobody to really just kind of point the finger at here. This is just difficult and complicated, but ultimately we want to do the best that we can to take care of our students and our families, obviously. So just wanted to flag, for Chair Jawana's millions watching at home, that this is something that all of us are talking about, and that we'll be having public conversations about that soon. Thanks.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all. I appreciate it. And we'll see you next time. With that, we're adjourned.